Welcome to the Gravity new domain public call. We are meeting weekly now, alternating new domain work and enhancement work. Today's meeting is addressing topics in person-level ethnic and racial discrimination, toxic stress, and protective factors, and we will get right into it. Next slide. Thanks for coming. Everyone's muted upon entry, but we do have a lot of conversation as we go forward. All calls are recorded, and recordings are always available on the Gravity Confluence after the meeting. Everyone's encouraged to actively participate in the discussion using the Zoom chat. Please send your concepts to everybody, your questions to everybody, and then we try as best as we're able to integrate them unless we're having a formal presentation. Again, we're just kind of going through core content today, so we should be able to integrate questions as we go. Next slide. Well, Jonathan, we'll miss you. We'll talk more about that offline. Jonathan's a core member of our community, and I hope you're feeling better, Jonathan. So Gravity Project is a standards development initiative, and so thus we are required to follow federal antitrust practices. All participants in Gravity Project meetings or any of our work streams have the responsibility to fully comply with federal and state antitrust laws. And we apply these rules pretty liberally, so not just, avoidance of the guidelines, adherence to the guidelines and avoiding antitrust behavior, but really making sure you avoid any behavior that might be construed as an antitrust violation. So this is just part of our work as a standards accreditation entity. It's a standards-based entity, and we just make sure that we all align with these principles as we do our work. Next slide. So we're gonna go to welcome and announcements, and then just briefly review our topics and goals for the time. We're gonna try to level set that every time. We're starting today with where we left off last time in the subject matter expert approved instruments for person-level discrimination. We're then gonna go into toxic stress and instruments that have been approved by our SMEs for your review. And then touch upon protective factor concepts. We don't have instruments at this time, but we have some themes we can bring forward. Again, wherever our SMEs are in the process, we want to share with you so that we can integrate that into this work. And then we're gonna actually close with community homework and next steps. We're not going to be doing the agenda item holding space today. It's still there from last time. My apologies. Next slide. Next slide. I actually feel like we forgot to take out the hymns thing. This just happened. I don't think we updated this slide, so my apologies on that again. It was a long week. So we have our new domains call and our enhancements call alternating. We have our technical work stream meeting Wednesdays 1 to 2. Our next Information Affinity meeting is not the 27th of February. It is the last Thursday in May. And the HIMSS presentation is just finished. We'll update the announcement slide for our next meeting. And again, you can find all this information on the Gravity Confluence. Next slide. Any questions on announcements? Okay, next slide. Gravity Project is striving to create a world where health and social care organizations readily share information needed to effectively meet the social needs of individuals, advance health equity, and improve health outcomes in communities. And we are working on our, this vision statement and refining it based on your feedback in upcoming strategic sessions. Next slide. The lexicon, this is really important when we consider the work that we're doing in this particular session. So at the population level, you have concepts of health equity and social determinants of health. But when you get to and protective factors, but when you get to the person level, where we are working right now is really leaning into protective factors for the first time, which are characteristics of strengths or characteristics or strengths of individuals, families, communities, societies that act to mitigate risk and promote positive well-being and healthy development. You hear me say all the time, this is like our daily practice in any early child development, pediatrics, administration of children and families work. It's also strengths-based initiatives are a core part of social work for many of the social workers on the call. And then negative forces are, we follow the lexicon of social needs that's developed by Hugh Alderwerk and Laura Gottlieb, which has social risks being those adverse social conditions associated with poor health. They're also called health-related social needs in other instances, and then social needs are when they're patient prioritized. And again, this is just important because we're leaning into protective factors today, so we wanted to make sure we always level set here. Next slide. Couldn't do what we do without our amazing members. Incredibly grateful for all of you. So many of you were together in Las Vegas at HIMSS recently, and many of you were on the call today. Again, thanks for being part of this work. And we have both sponsoring members and designated members based on our social justice framework, ensuring that patients and community-based organizations are able to participate in shaping the work that we do. And again, we always just say thanks to our in-kind folks, CMS, AMA, and Civitas Networks for Health, who help as members, but also providing staffing across our 3 work streams. Next slide. Our roadmap is here's where we are. Those green, the darker green concepts are on new domains. Our operating committee hopefully will be voting on a path forward for the environmental concept of the fall domains on Monday. And then enhancements are this ongoing work we have for, for enhancing and deepening our solutions to support social care integration. And then there's the technical work stream working on what they're doing. Again, we did not hold our technical meeting this Wednesday because of conflicting with HIMSS, but we have a really exciting meeting coming up in 2 weeks' time. And then implementation affinity group again is meeting next in May. Next slide. It's really important. I just mentioned this about the operating committee. Sometimes individuals wonder how things get on the roadmap. Like, why do we choose the work we do, the domains that we do, and how they happen, the order in which they happen. It seems really important just to note for everybody's awareness that everything that happens within Gravity is prioritized by members. So they're given options and selections, opportunities, and they collectively drive the roadmap that you see on that previous slide. Every new domain, every new use case, and it just is an example of the collective representative nature of the work that we do. So it's never just one entity. It's just all of our members together. Next slide. And then we try to do this every single time. We always try to ground in our principles. So our 6 principles are improving personal health outcomes, improving population health equity, ensuring personal control, designing appropriate solutions, ensuring accountability, and preventing, reducing, and remediating harm. And it's really critical that last, I say this every time, but as we are thinking about the final bullet, we deeply lean into the harm that's of stories and data not visible in the work we do in Gravity terminology, especially naming things, but we always are considering whether the data we're generating has the capacity to do more harm than good. And for anyone who was part of incarceration status, you remember this. It's important to note that that's what we consider as pretty much consistently whenever we do any of our domain work. Next slide. Any questions on the just brief orientation again for anyone? All right, we're going to keep on going. Next slide. Next slide. So I try to ground here, and then just because especially this came up, and I presented this last time, I presented it, I think, a few times, especially as we're focusing on instruments. There are many different opinions on best practices for screening for social risk. Our model does not depend on screening as a path to assessment, nor do we recommend specific practices or or frequencies regarding screening. There's emerging evidence and risk and benefit depending on the domain of reference. There's a lot of opinions on screening for things like interpersonal violence or interpersonal safety. We had very clear concerns on screening for history of incarceration. There are policy and regulatory drivers that define screening processes. They're outside of our scope, right? So these things like waivers, quality measures, state and federal programs and initiatives like Medicare programs, where we fundamentally are trying to create standardized language to standardize those screening or assessment events Again, not all use of standardized assessments is screening also, like some are used for understanding the depth of conditions as opposed to just the prevalence of them. And so just noting that as there are differences in processes, we can hold up ideas for best processes, we can have conversations regarding them, but our fundamental work is on the development of the data standards to support any and all. And again, just noting that we determined with incarceration, our standard was to not create them because the risk was just too great. Next slide. Oh, sorry, one back. And then just wanted to note that part of, this is a kind of a simplified version of the coding wheel that we offer every time these are the questions we're asking right now with subject matter experts and all of you. What are the standardized instruments used to identify the domain? What are the core diagnoses, both risks and conditions that need to be stated? What are the person-centered goals related to that risk or condition? And what are the things that the care team and the person do to address the risk or condition? Hi, Lucy. Yes?
Hi, Sarah and everybody. Could you go back one slide, please?
Yeah.
Our job is to create standards to support screening or not create if the risk of screening is too great. Is it within our scope to imagine how an alternative to screening that enables consumer patients who encounter health and social services to convey information if they want to? Screening is they're being asked,
Yeah.
and then they either passively react or object or whatever. Has anybody imagined how individuals can convey information that they wish to be known instead of being screened for?
Absolutely. That's what diagnosis. First of all, there's two answers to your question. The technical call. So Jonathan, I don't think that's exactly what Lucy's asking, but even though she may be, the technical call happening in a couple sessions actually goes really deeply into how diagnostic concepts can be applied from screening and the ethics and opportunities regarding that. And lots of members participated in that. So there's a really cool conversation regarding taking, assessing diagnoses from like standardized instruments happening in the technical call in 2 weeks. And that was the exciting conversation. So I encourage all to go. And I really want to make sure patient voices are part of that conversation. So that paper was an attempt to actually talk through the ethics and opportunities regarding some of what you're saying. And then we fundamentally create diagnostic concepts independent of screening, because in our way back in the beginning, we had a slide that just says paths to assessment, and one was screening and one was just storytelling. One of the stories that I tell about my own practice and the clinical practice is a patient doesn't need to have a hunger vital sign given to them if they are literally just saying, gosh, it's been a hard month. My SNAP subsidies got cut. I'm having to cut my own meals so that I can feed my kid. It's just tough right now. They can just say that to me, and I'm like, hi, that sounds like food insecurity, right? So part of what we do build when we build our diagnostic concepts is the capacity for just listening and engagement and understanding toward that. And I want to state, in addition to support that, Lucy, I want to acknowledge the fact that even 2 weeks ago I said that I was going to reply to Susan, but we do sometimes try to participate in the development of diagnostic criteria that detail the concepts of domains that are important, that would liberate individuals from screening, but still create standardized assessment. So all these things are happening, Lucy.
That's great. Thank you. When is this meeting that you just mentioned? What is the date?
The next technical call is 2 weeks from yesterday, right? And Corinne, I think you're on the call, correct? So this is is that the
19th.
date? Yeah, I believe that's the date of and then Sue Bowman, is that correct? That's the date of the presentation that you all are giving?
So, no, actually the brief is going to be on the first meeting in April.
There we go. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I'll send the meeting link in the chat as well.
Yeah, so Lucy, it's the first meeting in April. It got postponed because it was supposed to be yesterday, but it was in the middle of hymns, so we moved it. But the first meeting in April.
Thank you.
Yes.
And thank you for that response. And I have to note the language you use to be liberated from screening. That's
Mhm.
that's interesting and I'm sure appropriate for a lot of people faced with questionnaires or intrusive questions. Thank you.
Mhm. Okay. I'm glad we had a good answer. Oh, look, and I thumbs up. Anyone, and I want to just note that the we have a whole separate kind of assessment brief we're working on, but like again, to honor the social workers out there, if you're completing a biopsychosocial assessment of a person, which is core to the social work practice, it includes understanding of many of the things that we talk about having screening instruments for, but it just happens through trust and understanding and like compassion and clinical practice, right? So just props to all the social workers. Next slide. I think there's things I might be missing. Okay. I think we're doing great. Okay, perfect. Okay, next slide. Okay, I think we're ready to move on to our spring 2025 topics and goals. Again, this is just a level set, like where we are. Next slide. We're just having instruments today, so we did want to just because we have a presentation coming hopefully next week on protective factors, but where we are with our domains is we're leaning into concepts of person level experiences of racism, ethnic and racial based discrimination, really trying to tell the story about how racism, racial and ethnic discrimination influence health. And we are leaning into the person level, even though we're leaning into it, but talking about it, and I forgot to mention this, talking about how to represent structural racism in our concepts. But because person level is the point of care that we are addressing in our work. We're also discussing toxic stress, which is terminology to tell the story how stress, how experiences can lead to the toxic stress physiologic response. We heard deeply about that with Makai 2 weeks ago. And we're exploring how the physiology of toxic stress can persist beyond childhood, and how that relates to concepts called weathering. And in protective factors, as I mentioned, we're telling the story about how we counter chronic stressors with strengths building and structural supports, enhancing self-sufficiency, cultural connectedness, social connection, resilience, self-esteem, uh, and as part of really like fostering wellness and preventing harm. I just want to note, and I mentioned this before, it's a core part of all child and family care. So if you're a pediatrician or a pediatric social worker or a pediatric NP or a family practice clinician, this is what we do every day. And it really is fundamental protective factors, again, in the perspectives of nursing and social work, as I already mentioned. Next slide. This is one of my favorite visuals of protective factors. Next slide. And then we still have these guiding questions, exploring how discrimination, whether discrimination based on race and ethnicity can be captured by just one concept, racism, exploring how to describe the physiologic toxic effects of adverse child experiences and weathering, exploring how to represent protective factors in the data classes and standards of healthcare terminology. We do not have a strengths list or a protective factors list. We have problem lists, and yet we do not do so many of the experiences in healthcare rely on assessing strengths and protective factors, so that part's going to be fun. Exploring the radical act of representing our strengths as the counter to our problems. That'll come, well, I promise we'll get to that. Next slide. And we just want to note, and again, you've all known this, like we have been ensuring that our subject matter experts don't have to disclose themselves just because of the sensitivity of this moment in time. And I'm glad you all have trusted us so far. Next slide. And again, just reminding us, this is challenging work. Sorry, the concepts that we're going to detail today and the instruments on ethnic and racial discrimination and ACEs are hard. And we just want to anticipate that they reveal challenging both historic and current truths. And understanding that we each, and our subject matter experts, many of them bring lived experience to this work, and just trying to craft this space thoughtfully and respectfully. And very, very grateful that our now dear friend, Dr. Kwesi Pote, is here to assist with the complexities and sensitivities and care required for all of that complexity. Next slide. So we hope to be at a point where we had, we're kind of like on target in the complex way. We're in the kind of early middle of our concept identification phase, where we really focus on identifying instruments first, just because the instruments are geared toward measuring the concept that we're aiming for. And we are already, and you'll see threads of this, breadcrumbs of this, exploring how diagnostic concepts relate to those instruments, right? And you'll see more of that bloom over the course of the next weeks in time. And we're aiming for our May 29 consensus vote. Next slide. All right. And any questions so far? The next work is going to be going through and ensuring we adequately have time to review the instruments that the SMEs assessed, and then ensuring we reflect on some of the concepts therein as we go forward and why they're there. Okay, next slide. We again, as I mentioned, we're starting with the concepts the instruments and the concepts that we addressed at the end last time, because we didn't have time, because we wanted to flip it. And the next few slides are going to be dealing with concepts in person level discrimination, and just again noting it's challenging concepts. So we're just going to proceed with care. Next slide. Next slide. So there are 3 core instruments, and my job in these slides, I will state, is only to relay what the SMEs have identified, and then this Kwesi, Dr. Bote, is here to facilitate the conversation, the community conversation regarding them, and the SMEs, if they're here, they're able to they have opportunities to participate or not. We just want to note that that's how it's going to go forward. I'm going to read the concepts and reflect on the concepts and reflect on why they're here, and then Dr. Bote and our SMEs can answer further questions. So the 3 instruments that the subject matter experts have identified so far are unchanged. They're kind of the core. The Everyday Discrimination Scale, the Major Experiences of Discrimination Scale, and an abbreviated version. We're now going to go through those instruments over the next slides. Next slide. There is an important note when it comes to these instruments. When our subject matter experts were reviewing the available instruments, they took great care to focus on instruments that allowed for what they determined to be the attribution, which means the why I was discriminated. You can see this in the recommended options on the side, on the right-hand side of the screen. That was important, because the why it happened is where intervention, understanding, and action happens. It's also what defines it as within scope of our domain, which is focusing on ethnic and racial discrimination. The format of the Everyday Discrimination Scale is prefacing, in your day-to-day life, how often do any of the following things happen to you, with response categories of almost every day, at least once a week, a few times a month, a few times a year, less than once a year, or never. And the questions are: you're treated with less courtesy than other people are. You're treated with less respect than other people are. You receive poorer service than other people at restaurants or stores. People act as if they think you are not smart. People act as if they are afraid of you. People act as if they think you are dishonest. People act as if they are better than you are. You are called names or insulted. You are threatened or harassed. So for those questions that you answered a few times a year or more frequently, that's when you ask what do you think is the main reason for these experiences? And the answers are your ancestry or national origins, your gender, your race, your age, your religion, your height, your weight, some other aspect of your physical appearance, your sexual orientation, your education or income level, and then there's other categories to consider. Again, this instrument was selected because it is seminal in research and understanding. It included the attribution elements, the why elements. It's noted that it can, of course, assess other types of discrimination we'll address in other cycles of our work. And I think it's going to leave it open for questions at this time, if there are any.
Excuse me, we can also note that in reading these and listening to these, there could be some energy that you're currently feeling and you don't feel like this is a time to say or express something. That doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have some feeling about it. We would hope that you do. The goal would be that we could talk about, and or if we move forward, that you can understand the purpose and the intent of the subject matter experts to say, this is one way or one instrument that can help us towards the deeper conversation that could happen in that moment. Looping back to Lucy's question.
Can you guys hear me?
We can.
Yes.
So I guess I would say to this, to what end? If somebody comes and expresses themselves about what they think about how they've been treated or how they feel about what they treated, like what end, what resolution does that give them? And I say that both as somebody who has spent time in the system as like a foster child and somebody who's actually worked as a case manager in community mental health, right? Like the ability to actually contextualize it. So if I'm asking somebody a question, to be able to give them a reassurance that there's actually going to be some meaningful action taken around that. So I
Mhm.
guess if we're asking people to avail themselves in that way, in what way are we reassuring them that there's actually going to be meaningful action taken around them availing that sensitive information?
So to the first part of your question, Jonathan, thank you. Our hope would be, actually, it's unfair to say it. The goal, or to what end, would be that the bidirectional relationship that's happening with the provider, clinician, and the human being who's in the role of the patient is first an acknowledgement, the second is the affirmation, and then the third would be what is the access point to the care that that person could receive and what resources could be provided.
Okay. So it's a part of the assessment process. I get that, right? But when you have multiple conversations, and this might speak to why people are reluctant to share this because they feel like I've said this repeatedly. This
Yeah.
isn't the first time that I've been asked these questions. And so if it's not going to lead to any meaningful change, why would I continue to have these discussions? And again, I'm just playing devil's advocate, right? Like this is just coming from somebody who's actually been on the other side of that coin where I've actually been having these conversations with people, and it was difficult for me to explain to them why I'm
Mhm.
asking these questions, and then they're getting defensive with me, and the only thing that gives them any reassurance in that moment is me, because I'm contextualizing it and saying,
Mhm.
listen, I understand, I hear your frustration, I hear your concern, like this is part of a bigger picture. And part of the reason, I'll try to keep this kind of concise here because I'm suffering through a fever right now. So if I'm a little delusional, like just just kind of bear with me, right? But as we're having these kind of conversations, like part of what I like about this work is because people don't see behind the curtain. They don't see the time and effort and energy that goes into this. And so the ability to actually convey that to them and contextualize it to give them the comfort and the reassurance that if they share that in the space and we get critical mass, that there are things that are being done to kind of address these things on a higher level,
Mhm.
but it's the ability for the care provider, specifically physicians or social workers or case managers, that can contextualize it and convey that in a moment. And I think that if I tie that to like what we're doing here in California with the data exchange framework, it's the ability to actually go back and say, we actually want to figure out how to do it, but we can't just do one off cases. We actually have to have a critical mass. So then we can point in the right direction to say, this is an issue. These are the resources that we have to address it. And this is how we're going to do it. Does
Mhm.
all that make sense?
It, it, let me be clear with the it, and you're not, and your fever is giving you more clarity than you might believe. Some part of what you're offering, and I'll be clear on the what. Context is also a requirement of the clinician.
Yeah, that's right.
Some part of how a clinician comes into any space to ask a human being, and I will be clear in saying this, if someone looks at you, Jonathan, as a Black man, and let's say that provider doesn't have the same hue of skin or gender than you, I would offer, in a lot of the work that I do, is I tend to ask a clinician when I'm doing some training with them, what are the 10 reasons you don't want to be Jonathan here? So before you start asking Jonathan questions, consider those before you give context. For most people, that providing that framework for the clinician is also some part of our hope, that to what end the clinician doesn't re-traumatize the human being by asking questions, that person is saying, my whole life, my whole journey to this entry point has been this. And I'm sitting here in a moment of crisis or need, and you're asking me things that bring things up for me, which I do not want to do if there's not going to be something that's going to help me, because throughout my whole life, this has been my journey. We are
That's right.
mindful of that. So
No,
that
that's right.
context giving is necessary. And there's also a space to suggest, and we've had these conversations in other areas with the SMEs, is how are we helping the education of the clinician, provider, whatever we're going to call that person, to be mindful of what asking these questions will bring up, because something's going to come up. That it's not a small ask, which is why the task was created in the first place. The ask was, these things are happening on a regular basis, and we have no way to offer your experience, Jonathan, for you in that moment. We have no way to attend or affirm, because we have no diagnostic code that actually contextualizes what's happening to you. So if we don't have that, then we can't do something with it, because then how do you code it? Someone's pushing back in the record saying, yeah, but that's not what I saw. If we can affirm, attend, and then be accountable to what this experience is by what we therefore code, now we have movement. If we don't have that, then we're stuck in the same rubric of saying, well, I understand that you're going through something, man. And now you're looking at me going, we're doing this again. We're doing this again, which then defaults into either I'm silent or I'm not going to talk, or if I raise my voice because I haven't been heard and I think you're not hearing me, and all the other variables which go into the context of who a person might be visually seen in that moment. So
No,
that
and that I'm sorry, I cut you off.
no, go ahead, go ahead.
Well, and then that goes into the conversation, Sarah, that we were having last week, right? About how, like, the physicians, and we're talking about, like, if they actually had the data on the affinity call, would they do it? And then somebody brought up the pushback about the Hippocratic Oath, and if they actually document something, that they have to take meaningful action around it. And then that's where, like, when you have a social worker or somebody who's a caregiver who can actually bridge that gap in communication, and it becomes more difficult when we have like bilingual considerations that are involved. But you have somebody that can literally go and say, okay, Mr. Doctor or Mrs. Doctor, like this is what the patient is saying, and then going to the patient and saying, this is how you need to express it to them because they're actually trying to help you. But if every single doctor, and I used to call myself a sales caddy, like a golf caddy to doctors, right? Because my whole goal was to actually help them make a faster decision, what was better for the patient. And that all started because I did social services work, because I'm like, listen, you're talking to them like they understand what it is that you're doing, and you're getting frustrated because you don't have the time to contextualize it all because you're overworked and you have all these other things to do. And the patient doesn't care about that. They don't understand that and they don't see that. They just know that they waited for 45 minutes longer than they were supposed to actually come in and see you. And then they don't feel seen or heard. And then you're asking them all these intrusive questions and you're glossing over a lot of things because you don't have the time to take the meaningful action, which is why I thought we were doing some of this work to kind of create the framework and the standards, to create consensuses, to create a mechanism to capture all that information, to allow them to take more meaningful action at the time that
Mhm.
actually leads into better patient care. And again, I apologize. I was not even intending on having this much of a conversation. I'm a little fluish right now, so I apologize.
Okay.
So
Please don't.
if I'm a little over the place, I apologize.
Please don't apologize. And my hope would be as we're all in the space with you, Jonathan, we can appreciate the context and the counter narrative. Oftentimes we can engage and work without the counter narrative. So I want to acknowledge, I'm not speaking for everybody else. I'm acknowledge that it's important that we hear counter narrative from living experiences. If you can't hear counter narrative from living experiences, we may miss vitally important reflective considerations and practices that we can implement so that we're not just doing something which can create a situation where a person is sitting there saying, why am I doing this? Why am I doing this again? I thought we did this thing. I thought we really did this thing, and I'll be clear so that we can be respectful of time. Even today in working with a patient, the assumption was that we were going to do a WhatsApp. For those that don't understand what I mean with a WhatsApp, either Jonathan and I could explain it. But when you do a WhatsApp with a patient, the patient is making an assumption based upon my characteristics, how I move, how I come in the space, that we both know how we're going to get down. That may not happen with a provider who may look very similar to me, but their characteristics and traits are very different. The hope would be that what we're doing here, Jonathan, mitigates the complexity of hue of skin or gender or identity when we interact. If we can create a way in which we can move so that we have less harm that happens, because the first thing that a person may do is you look a certain way, you must understand what I'm going to say. It may not be true. Or you come from a certain way and you must understand this. This is what re-traumatizes not just the patient, it re-traumatizes the clinician, it breaks down the continuum of care. Our hope is that as we're doing what we're doing now, the counter narrative that you're providing helps us contextualize the intensity of the therapeutic encounter when it happens right in a moment. If you can't get to that moment, or we're not creating a way for the sensitivity to be enacted so it becomes more intrinsic. If it's extrinsic, where you're just going to the extrinsic value, then that's difficult. And I contextualize that that's your point. When it becomes extrinsic and there's no value to me as the provider to create a person or whole-centered, whatever word we're going to use, to help the human being who's going through what they're going through, there's an intrinsic value to say that my experiences as a Black man in America is rooted in the crucible of racism. That's a very empathic awareness that we could hope people could have. If you don't have that awareness, it could be subsumed that the person is saying to you, so could you tell me why you feel you didn't get the same kind of respect at Trader Joe's, let's say. I could sit there, Jonathan, look at the provider and go, what the hell you mean? What kind of question is that? Yet the provider in that moment may be from an intrinsic value saying, I want to be able to acknowledge and affirm and attend by using this said instrument. And my goal is not to re-traumatize you, it's to affirm and actually be able to put something diagnostically in the record along with the story. So it's a both thing. And I'm hoping that makes some sense for everybody. And if others, please feel free to join in the conversation, because this is important. We're not taking away from our time. If we don't have these kinds of conversations, we can move forward and more harm could happen.
Well, and to your point, right? It's like you would hear people say the doctor has a very good bedside manner, right? And in those moments when they have to take the time that they can actually listen and be present and have those discussions, right? And then on the flip side, when you see behind the curtains, like the doctors that are so stressed out and all they want to do is get home because they want to see their kid's soccer game or they want to have dinner or they're exhausted because they still have to dictate and all these other pressures, the ability, and I kind of feel like I see it from as a practitioner, a provider, as a patient, right? Because I've been kind of in all those different roles to go back and say everybody's perception is their reality. But the
Mm,
ability to actually give somebody a tool that they can use that actually saves them time to actually
mm,
provide better care that leads to better outcomes, but then also educating the general public as to why those things happen is I think the crux of what we deal with here. And Sarah, I know I've said this to you multiple times. Like if we get overly specific and overly prescriptive and we drill down too deeply on some of these things, it doesn't allow for the organic development of the way that these processes can grow organically and allowing the providers to nuance it and then give it back to us. So I do it kind of tongue in cheekly, but I look for like key opinion leaders, like when we talk about TEFCA and the data exchange framework, because like I want to know what you honestly think. If you're a provider and we're giving you these tools, tell me what you honestly think. Because if I'm in conversations like this and they're saying things that don't make sense and aren't tangible and aren't relatable, then this is the conversation to have that, right? So that we can actually talk about those things and create a tool that actually makes sense. And then, oh, by the way, my hope is, and I could be blithely naive about this, my hope is that if we give you these tools, then you are going to be able to take a step back, catch your breath, and then use them to give and provide better care because it allows you to be more present in the moment. Right. So I'm going to stop there. I didn't mean to sidetrack the conversation.
No.
I
mhm.
apologize.
That
Thank
is
you.
that one would argue, Jonathan, that, and I'm going to use a Star Trek analogy, that would be the goal of what we're going to transform into, is
Mm.
that the opportunity is in the reflection. When you give people tools that can allow people to take a moment of clarity and time to understand that this is not something, and that this clearly would be the human being who's in front of me, who's in the role of the patient, may not have ever been affirmed or attended to and given accountability to their experience. How does this moment allow me to do that?
That's right.
And further, I would offer, if we can consider how medical models in terms of diagnostic criteria have had to evolve over time, this to me is an excellent moment or an opportunity to provide the process of how that evolution can always happen. So we do not lose this thought leadership together. Usually these things happen with like a little group of people off to the side and they're like, yo, something's happening over here. And based upon the organizational culture, my mans and them are going to say, we're going to do this thing here. Cool. So everybody's going to eat saltine crackers with butter until someone says that, creates cholesterol before you have dinner. Oh, we should probably change it. Well, you catch us in one spot, you weren't everywhere else. This is a different kind of opportunity. So I really appreciate the counter narrative. I'm a big fan of counter narratives. And I also appreciate the deliberate care you are offering to all of us. I mean, what you're offering is care. You're saying, like, let's not do this thing which can create more. And further, let's make sure when we do what we're doing, we do get some structure around it. Period. I'm not saying
That,
you gotta be so
We call that the ivory tower narrative,
Mhm.
right? Like we're like operating in the ivory tower. And I'm gonna stop talking now because my fever is just really starting to whoop my butt. So, but
sorry.
thank you.
John, you might stop talking, but I was just about to say something I think Cressy's speaking to, but didn't say, which is that not only did you not interrupt, but you elevated a conversation that was pretty much all of the first meetings we had with our SMEs. Like like just know that we, like the subject matter experts, spent time just talking about everything you just talked about. Like, and just like thinking about that before any instrument was assessed, like talking about care and education and accountability, right? So I want you to know that not only did you not disrupt the conversation, you carried it through path, through concepts that we had with subject matter experts. So thank you. And I also want to state that the only thing I can offer in addition to that is like a pattern recognition of how we feel when we just have instruments in front of us and we haven't come to storytelling concepts yet, or goals that center humans, or the interventions that we do. This phase of our work together is always a little frustrating, right? But it's just the instrument and not the story or the intervention or the goal yet, right? And so it's hard. Like, and I feel, and I'm not, that's not to, this is an appropriate response, but I just want to note that that's something, and because you've been with us for a while, Jonathan, right? And you have, right? So just noting that, like, that's part of what I feel like happens is that the instrument's put there and we're like, this is not it. It's not all of it. It can't be all of it. Like, right?
Well, I always appreciate your guys' patience because I'm an operator, I'm a sales guy. So I just try to think about how to contextualize it and how to
Yeah.
get it how to get it in front of the end users. And in this case, the end users are dual. They're practitioners and providers and they're patients, but they're all people. And so
Mhm.
the ability to like contextualize it and kind of build that bridge for them to say,
Mhm.
this is why this matters. And we're trying to help you save time to provide better care. And this is where they're trying to meet you. But then it also comes down to an individual basis of being able to educate yourself and to be aware. And I think that that's where the providers and the patients don't get this. Like I'm lucky enough to be here to be in this conversation to see the work that's being done, but to be able to export that and communicate it to the masses is what really needs to happen is the challenge, right? And I'm just one person, and so we need more people that can come in and have this conversation to say, look, this is the really great work that's being done, this is why they're doing it, and this is what it's intended to do. And oh, by the way, you need to be involved in these conversations and have a voice to make sure that it accurately reflects rather what it is that you need and what is actually going to be beneficial for you, and getting away from the ivory tower mechanism of saying we're doing this because we think that this is what makes sense, and we've done it in a vacuum, in a bubble, and we've never asked anybody, right? And I'm not saying that that's what's happening here. I'm saying that traditionally that is what happens, and that is why people push back, both from a patient standpoint and a provider standpoint, because they're like, you're telling me that I have to use this tool, but you're not in the office with this patient screaming at me, and this patient's just like, they're telling me that they want to answer these questions, but they're not telling me what they're going to do with it, right? And so that's how I got us here. I'm sorry. This is the viral fever talking right now. Like I'm literally I'm literally just like spouting off at the wheel, and
Thank
I'm
you.
really going to stop now. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you,
If
Questy.
you keep saying you're gonna stop,
Yeah.
you're gonna start again. So that's the first thing. I'm gonna say, you ain't gonna tell me you're gonna stop, and then you because we gonna keep on doing the thing, which is beautiful that we're doing what we're doing. And the maybe I can encapsulate what you're offering in this way. We're just getting the griddle hot, brother. We're just getting the griddle hot. That's all that's happening. We're just getting the griddle hot. We got, we're gonna end up putting some pancakes on this thing in a minute, but we're just getting the griddle hot. We understand that you coming into the restaurant talking about I want to eat now because I got some other people I got to feed. Now, don't let me finish my analogy. That I'm right. I understand that I'm coming to the restaurant saying, hey, there's a lot here, a lot, people. And what we're offering in the present moment is an appreciation of the a lot. And we're also being really mindful of the fact that if we get the griddle, we put the stuff on there too fast, we're going to burn a whole lot of stuff up. And
No, that's fair. You can fry an egg on my forehead right now, though. I promise you.
you know what I'm saying? And it probably still tastes good. It probably still tastes good. So let us be mindful of the patience and the practice that we're all trying to elevate, and our individual living experiences. I can't stress this enough. Our experiences are living. They're not ED'd. They're not ended. They're all living experiences. So each time we meet, our experiences are continually growing and evolving. And that's going to contextualize the work that we're doing. And to Sarah's point, if we can start someplace and we can ensure that we anchor it to meaningful and thoughtful contribution and collaboration, we'll always have a way to tether it to an end. So we're trying to move away from the organizational theory of organizational culture where just some people kind of do their thing quietly. And then you say, oh, that's what somatization means. And we're trying to move away from those experiences. And also Maybe the last point here for myself would be narrative therapy, or the ability to understand how stories evolve and how the cognitive changes in a person when their stories can be affirmed, attended to, and accountable, is a very powerful skill. A very powerful skill. And it takes time to learn that skill. I've been working with people for a long time, and many people on this call maybe can attest to this, yourself as well, Jonathan. Everybody doesn't have that gift. It's a very intuitive gift. Also, we have to be mindful that as we start the griddle, we got to just teach some people how to just stir the mix. Folks don't even know how to stir the mix yet. You know what I'm saying? Like, we got to be mindful of that. We're going to be pouring some stuff on the griddle, and folks don't even know that you just got to put this stuff together and stir it around a little bit before you add the egg. You just got to like stir around and make sure that like the dry ingredients are mixed. That's what we're trying to do. Yes, it's going to take some time, and we got great leaders, great thought partners in the room. It's going to take a little minute, and I'm so happy that we're here. Everybody cool with that? We're going to get on now to whether we're going to use olive oil, vegan butter, oil. We're going to move on a little bit from that.
I do want to honor, though, that it makes sense that it took this amount of conversation to really sit with the first instrument and feel how significant and impactful it is. And I'm glad we had this conversation, right? So thank you. How do we feel about moving on to a different instrument within the set? There's themes there. Are we ready? Okay, I'm going to move us on. The next one is one of two. It's a large scale and then a smaller version of the scale. They're very similar themes in this instrument than the prior one. This is the major experiences of discrimination scale. You can see once again, we are the subject matter experts selected this instrument because it allowed for attribution. And these are the concepts, the attribution meaning ancestry, national origins, gender, race, age, religion, etc. And then the prefacing, Lucy? Do you have a question?
Go ahead and finish. I have a comment when you're done.
Okay. And I'm going to read through the concepts just as I did with the other instrument. There's an abbreviated version of this instrument on the second slide that covers similar concepts, but it's just shorter. In the following questions, we're interested in the way other people have treated you or your beliefs about how other people have treated you. Can you tell me if any of the following has ever happened to you? And then it's a yes, no response. At any time in your life, have you been unfairly fired? For unfair reasons, have you ever not been hired for a job? Have you ever been unfairly denied a promotion? Have you ever been unfairly stopped, searched, questioned, physically threatened, or abused by the police? Have you ever been unfairly discouraged by a teacher or advisor from continuing your education? Have you ever been unfairly prevented from moving into a neighborhood because the landlord or realtor refused to sell or rent you a house or apartment? Have you ever moved into a neighborhood where neighbors made life difficult for you or your family? Have you ever been unfairly denied a bank loan? Have you ever received service from someone such as a plumber or car mechanic that was worse than what other people get? And it asks yes, no, but also when was the last time this happened and how many times has this happened during your lifetime? Lucy, was your question regarding this instrument?
Yes. I am speaking now as someone who has unquestionably benefited from structural racism, something that I didn't know for a lot of my life, but that I try to be conscious of now. It seems to me, from my perspective, that answering these questions before the questions on the previous slide might be easier. And please correct me if I'm wrong, because these questions evoke memories of life experiences as compared to the previous questions, which seem so intimate as to be intrusive. If I've been unfairly fired or mistreated by the police or had neighbors around me harassing me, it seems to me that that kind of story would be easier to start a conversation about. If the answer to all these questions, let's just suppose, were yes, then the person listening could say, go back to the previous slide, well, do you think that this is why? So that's just my reaction to these questions. They're so specific. They're so precise in terms of what somebody may have experienced. And then what do you think is the main reason? All of these things would come out. So that's just my thought. I think these questions are terrific. I also think it's obvious, based on what Jonathan has just made us all aware of, that the provider can't fix any of this. There isn't a provider in the United States who can fix any of these problems by themselves. But it lets the person talking to the provider, gives them an opportunity to say what it's like to live here as the person that I am. And if the provider, I don't know how the provider is supposed to react to this. Maybe we can talk about that. But
Well, the first piece would
I'm
offer.
sorry. So I
the-
just to keep groping for how to convey my feeling here. The feeling here is that these questions are so specific and will evoke experiences that are so common that it might be easier to start the conversation by starting here.
So Lucy, to your point, and thank you for that. And I want to go back to something that Questy said earlier about that not everybody has the skills to do this or the willingness to do this, right? And so it
Right.
starts with, are the doctors even willing to have the conversation, right? And if we give them the tools that make it easier for them to have the conversation, they can build up the emotional resilience and the tools to be able to ask these questions. But then I think, to your point, what I tried to make earlier is the ability to actually contextualize on what they're actually going to do about it. And the reason why I say that about people's perceptions is when I was doing workforce and economic development in Benton Harbor, Michigan, if anybody knows where that's at, that is a very social economically depressed place. And it's very dichotomous. There's poor black and poor white people. And I was teaching a class, and this person came up to me and they were like, "Oh, Mr. Silver Spoon in your mouth," and this, that, and the other thing. And when I pulled them aside and I had a personal conversation with them and contextualized it, they were like, "I had no idea that you came from this type of background." I was like, "Well, how would you? Like, you're just judging me because I'm the person that's in front of this classroom giving you this information." But it's not until we had an interpersonal discussion that you actually are understanding that I have a personal perspective and history that allows me to be influential in this regard. but you have to stop judging people by their color. But the only thing that makes me different than somebody else in that situation is I was willing to have the conversation. And you can't force people to have conversations that they're not willing to have, but you can start by giving them the tools and putting them in a position to lean into it if they choose to. If they don't choose to use the tools, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. That's a different conversation.
Thank you, Jonathan. And Lucy, I want to honor a space around what a provider can do with the tools and resources they have is a connection with the human being who happens to be in the role of the patient. So to Jonathan's point, there are many people who I have worked with that I could and definitively did do something about their answers to said questions. I do not know wholly that every provider on this call or colleagues that I have across the country and world would agree that there's nothing that they can do when somebody says that they have been fired from their job due to their hue of skin. So I would be remiss not to acknowledge the both end of that space. There may be providers who this may be the first time, to Jonathan's point, that they're even asked a question like this, and they may not know. They may not know because what comes up for them is their own anchor to their experience. There are many other people whose experience is inclusive of their hue of skin, whether they might be as light as Sarah or as dark as Jonathan, whether they may be in a male or female or they, them living experience. We have gifts and talents, and many of those gifts and talents can be brought to bear when we have instruments, to Jonathan's point, to use. Right now, we don't have a way that sometimes our own innate ability to draw a story out can be very innate, because that's something I know how to do. I know how to say to a patient, to your point, Lucy, what brings us to this moment, rather than how are you doing today? So if I say what brings us to this moment, and someone says, man, I'm tired of having these people talk to me like this.
Mm-hmm.
Right on. And to your, exactly, it has to start in a space. So Lucy, I want to honor your context and the clarity around this instrument here. For some people is a safety question. These questions can be deemed very safe because it gives a person an anchor to experiences that they can contextualize, versus the prior instrument offers a both and question between the provider and the patient. So if you can contextualize certain specific understandings of discrimination due to a racialized identity, then one instrument may feel much more salient to you than another, whereby the patient may have a different living experience in how they receive the language that you offer. So there's both ends to both. And I appreciate, because in some ways a provider might take what you just offered as a way that they could move towards the human being who is in the role of the patient, because the questions make some sense to them. You can hear both points.
I would be very interested, maybe this is in the far future, but if we end up presenting the previous instrument and this instrument, asking the question or hoping that somebody would study, what is the best way to start? I guess that's what I'm really asking when the provider and the patient don't know each other, look very different, and have to figure out how to communicate within a system that may have treated one of them very fairly and the other one very unfairly.
I would offer Lucy to consider that is America.
Here, here.
So if we're all in this space right now on Zoom, we figured that out. And when someone said there's a virus going around killing a whole lot of people, miraculously, everybody got TVs, Wi-Fi, 5G, and computers delivered to their home within hours. It is not something that the system doesn't know how to do. It's a question of when there's enough pressure for the system to actually articulate itself and change.
Definitely.
Offer, that's what we're doing now. That's all. That, to me, that's what Sarah and others are leading us to do, is to say, There may not be a best way. However, if you collaborate together and we think together, we can create a way. So I would honor us in that space, Lucy, that there may not be the best. We can keep on improving how we interact, and not just in the patient encounter, just as human beings, period.
Mm-hmm.
Every provider I know is not in that provider space 24/7 of their life. And a simple example I will give you is if you're in a grocery store and somebody's standing too close behind you, you can feel what that feels like when you don't like it. That's the same way when you're in an encounter with a patient who isn't you, doesn't come from where you come from, they can feel that same energy. If we don't spend some time in uncomfortable situations and learn how to regulate ourselves, we will not be able to interact with people who come from different experiences, different ethnicities, and different spaces. And that is where the tension lies. So we have to work out within this scope, and as well as in our own individual capacity, so that when we have an opportunity to work with somebody, our anchor is not to what was, it is to what can be in the present moment.
Definitely. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So Kelly is offering the chat, if folks haven't seen it in the chat, that Kelly, if it's okay to read what you wrote, is that okay?
And I can come off mute too if it's helpful. I know I'm new to the space, so folks may not know me, but I'm identify as a white woman, so have benefited from a great deal of privilege, and so come at this from that perspective. But it was just interesting to hear Lucy's reflection, because before she shared, I was having actually the opposite response to this tool, and trying to think if I had experienced these things, that level of detail at about an event that is that traumatic might be a very difficult thing to share with someone that you don't have a relationship and a trusting relationship. So I actually had the response that the more generic tool might be an easier way to enter the conversation if it's meaningful, and kind of trying to think of, as someone that hasn't been in a clinician role in these kind of encounters, when it might make sense to get into this level of detail and when that would elucidate what's happening in the treatment space. And I think that's the goal of these tools, right, is to have tools and use them when they're relevant. But anyway, I had kind of the opposite reaction to thinking about the use of this tool. So I just thought that was worth sharing.
Thank you, Kelly. And again, to affirm, we're just turning the griddle on, so we need some different kinds of spatulas to make these here pancakes.
Yep.
And if your reaction and your lived experience, your living experience, gives you sensitivity to one or to the other, in some ways, I would offer that's helpful. Because the more that we have, the more we can begin to synthesize where do we go next. So thank you. Pancakes are the greatest things ever created. Some flour, a little salt, a little sugar, and some butter. Boy, you can turn them things over. And when someone's hungry, jelly, jam, you put anything on some pancakes, boy, the world's better. Even have them gluten-free, wheat-free, dairy-free now, it's a lovely thing. I know, y'all, I can try to create levity out of most things, and that's part of the gift of facilitation, is to take things that are really important, impactful, and intense, and create a space that you can exhale while we're doing something that is meaningful. So I don't want people to leave this virtual experience holding their breath. I would like you to leave this experience exhaling, knowing that, okay, we can come closer. We can tussle a little bit with some really difficult things that in many spaces, this may not be the conversation you would have. We can do that here, and we can be thoughtful, and then we can learn how to have these conversations, to Jonathan's earlier point, in other spaces. Knowing that we've gotten some skills and some gifts from this conversation that we can use, and or maybe there's some things that we use and we say, you know what, yeah, that wasn't helpful. And that's also cool. If it doesn't work for you, just leave it in the ether. If it works for you, take it and use it freely.
I will just say that this meeting is unique in my life, and I have been to a lot of meetings, as everyone on this call has.
Thank you, Lucy.
I think, Kwesi, to your point, like part of being a leader in any space is you have to be, to a certain degree, uncomfortable. You have to be comfortable being uncomfortable. right? And part of this is giving people tools to identify where that they can lean in and get better and where that they can actually improve, and building bridges to allow people to see the commonalities of why they're coming together. And healthcare is one of those spaces that people are coming together, and oftentimes they're forced to come together, and
Mhm.
creating a space and a bridge that allows them to do that in a meaningful way so that they both walk away better. Right? If
Right.
I'm a practitioner, I walk away and I'm a better care provider and I'm getting better outcomes, which makes me feel better about the job that I'm doing. And if I'm a patient and I feel like I'm seen and heard and cared and considered and taken care of, then I feel like I was valued as a human being. And I think that creating tools that allow both the provider and the patient to come together in more meaningful ways is really the spirit and the intention of the work that's being done here. And I think that being able to create more awareness around it when the time comes, when the griddle's hot, when the pancake batter's ready, when we
Know what
have the
it
gluten-free recipe, when we
know
have
what
all
it
the
is?
dietary restrictions in order, and I'm a cook and I used to do all that, and I was feeding people is my love language. I get it, Quessy. So you're speaking to the choir, right? I don't want to derail the conversation and take away from the work that is being done. I'm just saying that bringing that perspective of, if we're going to ask these very sensitive questions, we need to, number one, identify the people that are willing to have those conversations, the people that are willing to use those tools, but then
Mm.
also be mindful of, regardless of how well intended it's going to be, how it's going to be received by the person that's being asked those questions. And I think that sometimes that's where this work falls short, not just here in the broader scope of social context, because things are done with good intentions. And when they're not received with the intentions in which they're done, now all of a sudden people become adverse and they're just like, well, I gave it my best effort and I got my face chewed off, so I'm not going to do it anymore. It's kind of like giving them a little bit more of a steel spine to say, it's not just you,
Mhm.
just be a little bit more resilient here, but also understand that you're asking very sensitive questions that may be re-traumatizing people, that don't dissociate between what actually traumatized them and why you're asking these questions.
Absolutely. If anybody has context, to remember when in New York City they had the age educators with the little panic buttons underneath the table. So I'm 55, so if those don't remember that, the human being would be asked to come into a room, and it's just a chair and you, and then the person says, so why am I here? And then the person across the desk says, I just want to inform you that you have had sexual contact with somebody who has been diagnosed with AIDS. And if the person reacted a certain way, you hit the panic button. Now, this is how folks started. To your point, Jonathan, think about that. This is how folks started. Now, where are we now? Does that land when I say that to everybody? Where are we now? That took some time, folks. That took some time. So I want to know for myself that each time we have these encounters, to your point, yes, where are our skills? How are we growing them? And we also have to be mindful that as we're on this call, the silence that's not in the room is also the loving and the wisdom that and the shine that's in. So as we go out, we have to model in some ways an exceptional amount of resilience and care with the people that we serve, because we have to model what we're doing here in our actual practices. That's when things change. When people see what you do and you do it well, and they see your shine. If you're in a rural community, and I can speak to this from something else today, if you go to a rural community and you see somebody who can care for individuals in a way that is so nuanced, and then you can say, now what Sarah just did, I never learned in school. And I need to learn how to do that. If we can continue to do that, then what we're doing here is going to be something that is novel. If it gets into a space where we can't replicate out what we're doing, then to your point, John, more harm will be harm. So Lucy is putting and asking the question openly, how are other people feeling about what we're talking about? Feel free to use the chat. And again, I'll always say, as a matter of practice, just because you ain't saying something don't mean you ain't saying anything. Silence is the most powerful gift that someone's ever been given. We just have to learn to understand what the silence means.
It's okay, Chrissy. I have one thought, which is that what we haven't really raised up is the work of Dr. Williams, which we're referencing here.
Mhm.
Like many of the questions I hear all of you very reasonably raising are the life work of the brilliant Dr. Williams. who has collated the instruments that we are referencing, and they're actually the citations and the links that we have on our slides. Right. So some of the questions on purpose and origin of instruments and applicability and effectiveness are actually contained in his decades and decades and decades of research and expertise and practice. So I just wanted, because we all want to make sure that we're bringing our thoughtful selves. If any of you have a desire to go, because you can see we pull these instruments from his WISE collation. His webpage is a source of wisdom and insight. It's just a really amazing place to go. So I just wanted to offer that for all of you as well, because it's some of the questions that we're asking are hard, and he's thought about them for a very long time, and so he's out there. His expertise is out there.
And he also has some, if you want to watch and make it light for yourself, he has a lovely way of answering questions in these short little videos that he makes too, for context that you might find on that website if you just want to listen to it. And we have about 12 minutes left, and as a part of gifts of facilitation, we don't like to end with like, bang, it's over, and go on to the next episode. This isn't like we're at home watching Netflix where we could just pause and go get some popcorn and come back. So I want to be mindful that in this space, what we've been talking about and how we've been exploring this area, let's give each other some space to just exhale and breathe out, and give Sarah the space to, as we transition out of the conversation. If folks have needs around questions that they want to ask, or if you want to ask those questions offline directly to Sarah and myself or others on the call, please feel free to do so. There's not something saying that we just have to stop. I'm just mindful of time. It's 5:19. We end at 5:30. And I want to be mindful of that. And I got a little shorty upstairs expecting that I'm going to take him to get some chicken. And he's going to be in my neck at exactly 5:30 talking about like, yo, you said you're going to take me to get some chicken. So that's happening. So literally standing over there.
I wonder if we could just, again, I don't feel like we should or have the bandwidth to go into different domains at this time.
Mm-hmm.
But I wonder if we can just close so everyone can see and take in the abbreviated version of this instrument that's on the next slide.
Mm-hmm.
And that would do due diligence to the instruments and the work the SMEs have done to this point. I felt I don't want to truncate this set, because they are a set, if that's all right. I don't feel a need to redo the questions, because it's built to be an abbreviated version of the major experiences of discrimination scale. But I would feel remiss in closing our work today, focusing on instruments on this topic, if we didn't at least present and honor this instrument as well, if that's okay. Does that seem fair? Okay. I do feel like it's wise to close, unless there's other observations. We don't have to advance slides or leave from this. We don't have to skip ahead and go across other material. That's not required, but there will be instruments on the master list tomorrow from the ACEs and toxic stress domain that the subject matter experts have approved, that we didn't cover today, but we'll start there next time. Any other final thoughts before we go? I really appreciate the care and thoughtfulness and intention that we've brought to our conversation today. Thank you for being here with us.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Lucy, for your comment as well in the chat. That's an important. And Lucy just offered that the text reflects some conversations could introduce how gravity got to these. My hand on my heart for everybody as we've walked together. Blessings to you and introducing yourselves in whatever way you're going to move into the weekend. care for yourselves and care for those who care for you. We'll see y'all back at the same time next week or in a month,
2
2
weeks.
weeks.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.